Hello, this is Jonathan with Steel Bear Academy. This is going to be part 3 of our How to Persuade Someone Who is Anti-Gun to Becoming Pro-Gun. We've talked about ethos and pathos so far as our 2 of our 3 appeals to persuade, our rhetorical appeals. So next we're going to talk about logos. Logos is an appeal to logic. So logic is a larger category that I don't really have a great definition for, but you'll probably get the idea. Logic is things like reasons, evidence, conclusions, the ways in which you present things, order, meaning like the order in which you present information. Logic is all about how you go about proving things are true in the world, let's say. In persuasion, it really comes down to those things I just described. Reasons, evidence, conclusions, the order in which you present them, and your presentation progression in general, the logic and how you present them. So for example, I present these 3 points, ethos, logos, and pathos, in order of which I think is most appropriate and most important, and try to link the 3 together to prove how they all come together to make persuasion in total, and culminating in my attempt to show you what I think is a persuasive way in which you can show someone, get someone to move from being anti-gun to pro-gun. So logos is a big category, and I'm just going to kind of go into some ways in which you can try to use good logos to bolster your arguments. So we talked about how pathos is the thing that moves you, meaning moves the audience to do something. If you don't have all 3 of ethos, logos, pathos, something is not going to go right, and you're not going to persuade somebody. So we already talked about if they don't trust you, they're not going to listen to you. That means you're not going to persuade anyone. If you don't have something that tugs at their heartstrings that makes them feel emotionally drawn to do something, they're not going to do it because they're not motivated to do it. You can have those other 2 and still persuade somebody to do something. So if you have trustworthiness and you have emotional appeal, you can still move people to do things, persuade them, let's say. However, you're probably not going to persuade the people who need all 3. And I think most people need all 3 if they're in the right state of mind and have their needs met and they're not desperate. I think most people need all 3. So logos is that third key, which so many of us think is the most important key, but it is really important, but it's not as important as you perhaps think. It is where a lot of arguments fall apart. It's where a lot of persuasion falls apart. But those other 2 are arguably more important in a way. However, we're going to not try to lose any part of it. We're going to try to do everything to our maximum ability. Remember, the point of this is so that we can persuade more people to join our side of being pro-gun, and to help those people who are anti-gun to enjoy the benefits that we have gotten by being pro-gun and having guns in our lives. So where do I start? I would say the first place to start is to think about facts. Logos is built on evidence. Logic is all built on evidence. The facts that you present really build your case. So you don't want to if you're just talking to someone casually, they're not going to have all the facts, meaning they're not going to have a well-built case, and you're probably not going to have a well-built case like it's all written out and you've got references for everything. Instead, you want to kind of stick to the things that you think are most important, that you're going to have to pull out of your back pocket, and those things that are most commonly going to occur. So when we're talking about self-defense as the reasoning why you should be pro-gun, there's one really big, I think the biggest, let's say the biggest hurdle for people to get over is whose job is it to protect somebody? So whose responsibility is it to protect you, the audience? So if I'm speaking to you, that might be my overarching question. I may not ask it specifically. I might come to it just via questions. But that's what I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to establish that it is not anyone else's responsibility but you, the audience. Now, that's the overall goal. However, you need to be mindful that that is a very, very hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. It might seem totally logical to just say, well, yeah, of course, I'm the one who's responsible for me. Well, a lot of people don't think that. A lot of people believe that somebody else is going to be responsible for them. They are told lies by other people, by the government, by people who they trust, parents, etc., and friends and schools and faculty that somehow the government will save you, the government will protect you, the government will provide for you. The government doesn't do any of those things, really. And even if they do it sometimes, they can't be relied upon. So hopefully this is going in the order of where you're going to be moving to in your argument. Hopefully you see the path already I'm setting out for you, but we're going to attack the main argument or the main belief about anti-gun people, that the police will protect them. This is really what a lot of people believe. They think that they don't need guns because the police will protect them. Now this is definitely come into a huge a huge change in the last year or two, because there has been so much more anti-police sentiment. However, this actually helps the pro-gun argument tremendously, and I think it's going to be pretty clear why. So for those of you who have been living under a rock, there's a huge growing sentiment that the police are corrupt or can't be trusted or don't do their job well or something. People have a huge lack of distrust in the police, or at least it's perceived that way. I think generally most people like the police, at least in the United States, but there's a vocal minority that is very anti-police, and it manifests in people saying we got to defund the police and reallocate resources to jobs that are not the police, so that people can do those jobs that the police were expected to do but were not adequately trained to do, etc. And there's just the belief that police are racist in general, and that the practices of policing are racist. All these things I'm not going to get into right now, but I will suffice to say that all these arguments that are so wrapped up alongside the anti-gun people, generally people who believe all those things I just described, are also anti-gun. And so we can use all those beliefs that I just described against them to help convince them to become pro-gun. Now, this might seem kind of silly, but it's actually, I think, very helpful. If many, let's say, left-leaning people, leftists generally, believe that the police are not going to be able to help them, well, if you ask them, if you just start by asking curious questions, just like we talked about in Ethos, curious questions to say, so have you ever called the police? They'll probably say something to the effect of either no, or yeah, I called them and they didn't do very well, or yeah, I called them and they totally did this bad thing and blah, blah, blah. Some bad thing about the police, which I don't know. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Who are we to say? We weren't there. We might not trust their versions of events, but it's really irrelevant to how to persuade them, at the moment at least. If they say that they had a bad experience with police, you might just move directly into asking, so if you were assaulted, if somebody tried to break into your house and kill you, and they have a knife, let's say, they're bigger than you, they're stronger than you, and what are you going to do? How are you going to save yourself? If you ask them this question, they're probably going to either say, call the police, which of course is hilarious because they just got busy saying how much they hate the police and the police don't do their job and blah, blah, blah. Or they're going to come up with some scenario in which they're going to elaborately defeat the attacker without the use of any guns or training or anything. They're gonna come up with some scenario, say like, well, my cousin taught me how to run real fast, and we're gonna push over a chair and run out the back door, and then what? Who are you gonna call? The police, right? So you're trying to establish, one, that they are either depending on the police. So if they say, I'm gonna call the police, you're gonna respond by saying, well, didn't you want to get rid of the police? Now, if you ask it in such a way, it's probably gonna create some dissonance. It's probably gonna make them think like, oh, wait a sec. Oh yeah, I forgot. I did want to get rid of those guys, get rid of the police. Now they're gonna have to rethink how they're gonna do it. Sometimes that can be the whole crux of your argument, the whole crux of persuading them logically, is just getting them to understand that the locus of power and control in their life and responsibility for their protection had been placed with the police in their mind, and now they're saying, let's get rid of those things, let's get rid of those guys. Now there's a vacuum there, and they're like, oh, well, if it can't be the police, then there's only one other person it can be. Them, right? Obviously. If they go about the route of trying to rationalize how they're going to defeat this attacker who has a knife, who's bigger, stronger, faster, etc., then you're probably going to have to convince them a little bit of the nature of how vulnerable they are. Now, this is going to be a whole difficult challenge in and of itself, and this is a very touchy subject for a lot of people. I think that probably one of the first things that somebody has to really come to terms with before they become pro-gun is to have an intimate sense, or at least a good sense, hopefully not intimate in the sense that I don't want them to get hurt or anything, but they need to understand how vulnerable they are. Meaning, a lot of people grow up in a world where they've never had to contend with bodily harm to them. They've never had to contend with the very real possibility that they could get hurt or die or murdered or whatever. Many bad things can happen to them, and if they don't understand that those things could happen to them, they may not be able to comprehend these other scenarios that you're trying to paint for them. And I think it's going to be even more challenging to get past that point of getting them to accept their vulnerability, because that is wrapped up in so much complexity in their mind and their hearts and all that. But I think at the heart of it, if they spend one day, meaning like one full class in any grappling style martial art class, if you take them to a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school where they're sparring and they get to spar with somebody who is even slightly competent, barely, even somebody who's been there like less than 4 months, will probably make them submit. They will probably be submitted over and over and over again. They will probably be repeatedly exposed to how incredibly vulnerable they are just by this person in their BJJ class or wrestling or whatever class, how vulnerable they are to being submitted. Meaning, and for those of you who don't know, a submission in grappling is basically you spar with somebody. So sparring is the practice of engagement in which you both attempt to beat the other person in terms of usually a submission. Meaning a submission is where you get somebody in such a compromised position that if they did not tap out, they did not submit to you, they did not say, okay, good, stop. If they don't tap out, they would risk some serious bodily injury. So either they would get their joints broken or legs broken, face smashed in, etc. A submission is submitting to, it's like acknowledging that you lost, acknowledging that, okay, you got me. You would have effed me up. You would have killed me if you had continued on with what you were doing. And that's what sparring is, at least in the wrestling or grappling context, is generally trying to get a submission. So if you go spar for one class in which they give you someone who actually will try to submit you, or at least do it respectfully and do it at some level of competency, boy, it will change their whole outlook on how vulnerable they are. It's incredibly humbling to know that this 15-year-old kid in front of you who you think, oh, he's a 15-year-old kid. What's he gonna do? Then he just pins you on the ground, makes you tap repeatedly in less than 10 seconds every single time. Wow. This little 15-year-old scrawny kid just made me tap every 5 seconds for the last 5 minutes. It's going to change their whole outlook on how vulnerable they are. And that's a good thing. And it's a good thing because if you acknowledge your own vulnerability, that means you can take steps to change it. So we're trying to help them take steps to change their vulnerability by becoming pro-gun. So getting back to what we're doing logos-wise, we're trying to ask them questions about who's going to be protecting them. And we want them to get to the point where they realize that the police are not going to be able to protect them. So if they say the police can, you give them that scenario again, somebody tries to kill you in your house with a knife, etc. What do? They say, oh, I'll call the police. Ask them, have you ever called the police? They'll say yes or no. If they say yes, ask them, how long did it take for them to get there? Now, pretty much, if you've ever called the police yourself, you'll know that the police are always a couple minutes away, at least. Sometimes they're many minutes away. The time between when you know you need the police and when the police are no longer able to have stopped the situation that you needed them for is very, very short. You have a really short window there. I tried to look up how often police actually intercede and stop a crime. I didn't really find a valuable statistic on it, but I think it's safe to say it's exceedingly low. Like probably less than 5% of all calls that they get are crimes in which they get there in time to stop them. So that gives you an example of it's probably not going to be the police who save you. They can show up after the fact and write down the crime and go try to find this person who did this bad thing to you, but that's not much of a consolation prize if you're already dead, or you want to save yourself. You want to keep being alive. You want to not get hurt. If you want to not get hurt, calling 911, calling the police is probably not going to be the thing that saves you. You should still do it, but you're the one who's going to be protecting yourself at the end of the line. And this is probably the main thing that people logically argue against. They think that the police are going to save them because we've been told throughout our life and schools, parents, if you're in trouble, call the police. Well, that's true. However, you need to understand that the police's job is not to protect you specifically. So the police have a duty, written on all the sides of their police patrol cars and in their oath that they take. They have a duty to protect the public, and they have a duty to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the land, etc. Well, you are part of the public. However, you can't sue them if they don't protect you specifically. They don't have a duty to protect you or me or any individual person. They have a duty to do their job, which is protecting the public, but you're not, in a way, you're not part of the public. You're just an individual. So I know that sounds kind of silly, but it's actually held up through case law. So there's a couple very famous court cases that help you prove this point. So if somebody says, well, no, the police are there to protect you. Well, you actually have court cases that you can show them and say, no, it has been established by the courts. One of them is a Supreme Court case. That's the highest court of the land. There is nowhere else to appeal it except to reappeal something else that would overturn that decision at the Supreme Court, or by a law. A law can also effectively overturn that, but then it might get overturned again. I digress. You have cases that you can show that this is the case, that police are not there to actually protect you specifically. They cannot be held liable for failing to protect you as an individual. So remember how I talked about how you're going to be the authority on this? Well, it's going to be very unlikely that people have researched these cases. And truth be told, I only know about them because I am involved in the gun world, and these cases get passed around so that it's easy for us to understand our laws and our rights and the things that relate to us and ways in which we can convince other people. But you want to be mindful that showing them these cases and showing them these court cases is only going to be useful if you've already got good credibility. So if you've failed in the ethos department, then there's no point in showing them these. They're not going to trust you, and they're not going to look them up, probably. Maybe you could show them anyway, but they probably will not listen to you. They'll probably think you're full of it. But if you have credibility, if somebody says something like, well, the police will protect me, that's when you can start saying, well, actually, the police don't have any duty to protect you. They'll say, what are you talking about? Well, let me show you 2 court cases where they definitively said, in at least 2 specific cases, specific ways, that the police don't have a duty to protect you specifically. So there's 2 cases that I'm going to talk about. One is Ford versus town of Grafron, something like that. It's a town in Massachusetts. This is from 1986, so it's kind of older, but it's an important case. And the specifics of it are important for you to look up, but basically some really bad thing happened. There was a person who had a I forgot now. Well, you want to look up these cases and be mindful of them. I think that this one was the one in which some ladies, this woman had so this woman had a court order to protect her from her ex-husband or something, and he was giving death threats, and she kept telling the police about it, and he kept doing bad things, and eventually it culminated in him tracking her down and shooting her several times, permanently paralyzing her, and then he shot himself. And she sued the city, or the town, and it got up to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and basically they ruled that she couldn't sue them just because she had a court order or a restraining order, let's say, even though there was a specific law that said if the police know about somebody breaking the court order, they have to go arrest him. The police didn't do it. Even so, she still lost, and it was still kicked out of court. It was still ruled that she didn't have a case. And so the takeaway from that is that the police don't have any duty to protect the individual. They can't be sued for not protecting you specifically, or anyone specifically. Just to their duty to protect the public. And even then, that's kind of a, we talk about, very oftentimes we talk about the Rodney King riots, the LA riots, in which if the police can't do their duty of protecting the public and they have to leave, like if something gets so bad that they have to just leave, and we don't even have to go back to Rodney King, we can go back to just last year. If something gets so bad, riot-wise or violence-wise, the police can withdraw. They can just leave, and they can say, we'll come back in greater force, and we'll reestablish order later on. But for right now, let's all get out of here, let's leave, and let's come back with more numbers. They can do that. They're not obligated to stay there and die. Nobody should just die for no reason, even the police, I think. So I think it's a good policy, honestly, at the end of the day. You don't want to just have police throwing themselves at a fire trying to put it out. So my point is that you can look up this case and you can point out that they don't have a duty to protect you as an individual. There's another case. This is an actual Supreme Court case. This one's called Castle Rock v. Gonzalez. So Castle Rock is a city, Gonzalez is a woman. And this one I do know. This is another one that is about restraining orders and whatnot. This one's from 2005. And basically this woman, this Gonzalez woman, she had a restraining order against her boyfriend or ex-husband or something. And he came and stole their children and took them and I think she knew where they were, but the police, and she had a restraining order against this person, this guy, and the police didn't go to save them. They didn't go to take the kids back. They didn't intervene in any way. My guess is, I don't know why, but they knew about it. They had the restraining order. They just didn't, for whatever reason. Maybe they thought that it was a lower priority than it was. Whatever the reason, ends up that the kids all die, and I think the husband kills himself as well. Might have hurt the woman as well, but for sure the kids all died. And so this woman sues, saying that she should have had the police guarantee that she'd be protected. There's some other strange nuances about due process, and it's not a material thing to have a restraining order, etc. Some weird stuff, but again, suffice it to say, there's no assurance by the police that just because you have a restraining order that you're going to be protected. It doesn't amount to a guarantee by the police or some duty to protect. And that also holds true for you in general. Just because the police are there doesn't mean they have a duty to protect you specifically. So these are all ways in which you can make logical appeals to say, look, if you think that the police are going to protect you, they're not. Look at these cases. These cases say they don't. And now there's this power vacuum of all of a sudden they thought that was who was going to protect them, and that's not. This is where you come in and say, this is why we need the right to have guns. Because if that person busts into your house with a knife, it's on you. It's on you to protect yourself and your family. So how are you going to do it? Well, unless you want to go, risk your life to fight somebody with a knife without any weapons, you're going to need a lot of training. And even then, you'll probably still get hurt. So good luck with that. Or you could go try to buy a gun, and at least you'd probably have a fighting chance. You got to get training on that too. So all these things are building up toward you finally allowing them to have this new slate of information where they go, oh, well, shoot. I thought that I was going to depend on the police, which again is ironic because they want to defund the police generally. People who tend to be anti-gun tend to also want to defund the police, which is hilariously ironic because the police weren't going to protect them anyway, and now they want to get rid of them, and they also want to get rid of their own guns. So who's going to protect them? No one's going to protect them. They're not going to be able to protect themselves. So I'm getting a little cheeky in this at this point, but basically, you want to remember your ethos. I'm being a little flippant at this point, but you want to be armed with the good facts. You want to be armed with correct facts. You want to be armed with knowing the cases at least ahead of time. You don't have to know every single statistic. I think a really important statistic for everyone to know is that people always talk about that. I think Obama said something like, well, did you know that the CDC isn't even allowed to research gun violence? Well, the CDC actually did. So in 2013, President Obama at the time directed the CDC to conduct research into gun violence. And they commissioned the national... Here, I got it in my notes. Let me take a look here. The Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council to conduct investigations into gun violence. One of their findings, and this is a very important statistic for you to know and be able to quote, is, we've all heard the gun death statistics, something like 105,000 per year of deaths, gun-related deaths. So you want to understand that deaths includes suicides, and a huge proportion of those is suicides. And when people are talking about gun violence, suicide is not really what most people would consider violence. It's violence against yourself, but that's really more of when somebody wants to die from themselves, not like victimized by somebody else necessarily, but like their life is so full of despair that they want to end their life, that's a whole different issue than somebody busting into your house trying to kill you. That's like a violent attack, right? That's someone trying to victimize you. Those are two separate issues. But people like to lump them together because it kind of exaggerates the violence part of it, the part that's like people trying to hurt other people. So just being aware of the statistics. 105,000 a year deaths, gun deaths. To counteract that, people often will say like, well, don't you know there's 105,000 deaths a year? Well, do they know how many preventions of deaths or preventions of crimes there are? Because that's really that's really like the closest scale point that we can measure to, right? Here's gun deaths over here. Well, how many lives do they save? That's a good question, right? Well, the CDC and those organizations that the CDC used to conduct this research found that they are somewhere, the number of crime preventions is somewhere between 60,000 and 2.5 million a year. So keep in mind that was 100,000 deaths a year, somewhere between 60,000, which is less than 100, somewhere between 60 and 2.5 million. That's a huge spread, like a huge spread. And it's hard to know, but even if it was somewhere in the middle, that's still like, at least a million and a quarter, something like that, of crimes that are stopped meaning guns are used defensively to stop crimes. Probably at least 1.5, something like that. I don't know the exact number, they don't either, but it's a huge spread. It's at least a lot, and it's probably more toward the center, let's say. It's probably a conservative estimate, to the center. So you can use that statistic to say, well, did you know that the CDC actually conducted an investigation into how guns are affecting the United States? And did you know that they guns are used defensively somewhere around 1.5 million times a year? That's a lot. That's a lot more than the deaths. And remember, those deaths include suicide. So I don't remember exactly. I think it's like 60% suicide or something like that. A significant number, like almost half or a little more than half. So even then, it's like 50,000. So even then, 50,000 is still less than the times it's used defensively. So if people want to get into the apples, comparison of numbers, really, utility, really, you can do that. You can compare those numbers. That statistic can help you make that argument. Part of Logos is also just being good at helping someone draw logical conclusions. So when I was doing those kind of scenarios, I was saying, well, so who's going to help you? Who's going to come to your rescue? People say whatever their responses are. Okay, but didn't you just say that the police are not going to, you want to defund the police, like get rid of those guys? Or you could say, didn't you say the police are racist and are corrupt and all that? Oh, well, I don't know. Pointing out those inconsistencies is part of good logos. It's part of picking apart the inconsistencies and fallacies in somebody else's argument, or at least in their belief system. But you want to be very careful with that. Debate is really where that kind of really comes into play. But you're trying to persuade someone here. You're trying to be respectful, mature. You want them to come over to your side, or at least move the needle towards your side. So be mindful of being kind and don't get too nitpicky about, your facts are not all correct. Your logic is not all correct. Listen, build that trust. You may not convince them that day. Maybe you'll convince them some other day, but don't burn the bridge just by being obsessively logical or obsessed with the logical aspects of it, because Persuasion is more than just the logic. It's all of those things all together. So this has been part 3 of ethos, logos, and pathos. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to put all those things together, and I'm going to try to make a video to, instead of speaking to you as the pro-gun people, I'm going to make a video about how to convince somebody else, how to convince those anti-gun people through video form. And video form is it's a poor substitute for actually convincing somebody. The best way to do it is actually through established trust, one-on-one with somebody where they trust you and you can help them to move towards your side, move toward your point of view. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any comments or tell us about some really useful statistics that you use, list them down below. Oh yeah, one other point. I also wanted to mention, you want to make sure that your sources are reputable and reliable. So don't pick, if you're going to quote a source, don't pick something that's like from the NRA. It's not going to work because people are just going to accuse it of being biased. Then you're going to be accused of being biased. It makes you look bad. You lose credibility. If that statistic is actually out there, find it from someone else. Find it from some other source, because it's just going to look like you're just rooting for your team and you're not actually interested in the truth. You're just interested in being part of the side, being us versus them. You don't ever want to be thought of as being those other guys. You and we're the same. We're on the same team. We're both rational, responsible, good people. We're on the same team. Let me show you how I'm pro-gun and you're anti-gun, and let me show you why we're actually on the same team, but I think you just didn't understand that the good people want guns as well. Good people can be anti-gun as well, but I think that they actually are more toward this side than they give themselves credit for, and they are also just need the right motivation and right persuasion to get there. Hope this is helpful for you, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a good night. Bye-bye.